This is, with me is Manreet, the best-selling author of 9 books, and also she writes for the New York Times and the South China Morning Post. But the book we're here to discuss today is the last of the Partition trilogy, which is the book about Kashmir, available outside, I'm sure. And when I was asked to moderate this discussion, I couldn't figure out why. But then I figured, okay, I'm a Kashmiri, I can do this. So, but it became a little more interesting because Manreet and I both live in New York. We connected there. And we both have corporate backgrounds before we got into literature and reading and writing. But with that, my first question to you, Manreet, is this is the culmination of 2 decades of intensive research and work, right, and writing. And you said you've been doing this for over 2 decades. So before we get to Kashmir, which I know you want to talk about, just fill us in on the genesis of what is really a huge project and a huge undertaking, and your methodology for research, because I know it involved an enormous amount of archival research.
Thank you, Kalpana. So diving right in, the Partition trilogy, as is self-evident, is a set of 3 books. Book 1 is Lahore, Book 2 is Hyderabad, and Book 3 is Kashmir. Lahore deals with the 9 months leading up to the independence and partition of India. So the narrative arc begins when Dicky Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, arrives and ends in September of 1948, just a month after independence and partition. Books 2 and 3, which is Hyderabad and Kashmir, really look at the princely states which had not acceded to India at the time of independence. Now, a common assumption I find amongst Indians, especially the younger people, is that the map of India that we see today is the map that the British left us. And this could not be further from the truth, because the British, the colonial British Empire, had no interest in the territorial integrity of India. So what India was pre-independence was really India, which was directly governed by the British, and then there was the princely India. So there were 565 princely states, and by the laws of India's partition, each one of them could choose to go to India or Pakistan, or choose to be independent. And this was around middle of May when this revelation was made. And Vallabhbhai Patel, who was the Deputy Prime Minister and the Home Minister in the interim government, along with his very able Secretary of State, VP Menon, then got down to the task of talking to the princes and convincing them to accede to India. So on the 15th of August 1947, only 3 princely states were yet to accede. Junagadh, which was a small state, and Hyderabad and Kashmir. Now, Junagadh, in the sense of timeline, got resolved very quickly, and I cover that episode in Hyderabad, Book 2 of the Partition trilogy. But Hyderabad and Kashmir remained. Hyderabad got resolved, I say that within quote marks, in September of 1948, when India invaded the princely state of Hyderabad and got Hyderabad to accede to it. And Kashmir, as we know, the problem, so to say, lingers to this day. And I was really interested in this because I come from a small town on the border between India and Pakistan. It's called Firozpur. Now, by the laws of India's partition, it should have gone to Pakistan because it was Muslim majority, but it didn't. There's a lot of speculation why it happened, and I will leave you to read my books to figure that out. But the sum of it is that I grew up with stories of partition that I did not find in my history textbooks. I also did not find them in the literature, whether it's narrative, non-fiction, or fiction that I read. But you know how it happens when you're a child, you're more interested in physics and math, and you got exams to ace. All of us Indians understand that, right? So I was so keen to escape my messy hometown that I did engineering, I went to a business school, I had a corporate career for a decade. And I had no idea that I could even write. But then we moved to Singapore, and I decided to take a sabbatical, like a break from my corporate life. And Singapore could not be more of a contrast to India. It's very orderly, anodyne, removed from the chaos of certainly India and very much Punjab. And a strange thing started to happen because I was yet to become a mother, so it was my husband and he would leave for work early morning, and I would sit in this sort of pristine, clean space, and it was almost as if the mustard fields of Punjab were colliding with the orderly lanes of Singapore. And I thought, okay, maybe I can just write a short story and be done with it, I am a trained MBA, I know how to tackle these things. And suffice to say, this was in early 2000, and I realized that I did not understand what I was trying to write. I did not understand, for instance, why the Sikh militancy has happened, which coincided with my adolescence, which was kind of a copy-paste of 1947. And from there on, I started to do what, when you were searching for knowledge at that time, my Google was the library. So I started to spend a lot of time in the library, looking at books, reading them up, trying to understand why what had happened had happened. And everything seemed to lead back to 1947. That was sort of the pivotal point when things had changed. And suffice to say, the short story became a long story, became a novel, which is my second published novel called The Long Walk Home. And from there on, I have just been researching, trying to understand the narratives of Partition, starting with my own family, people in my hometown, expanding from there. So I'm just so glad that I'm done with the trilogy. Kashmir released yesterday, and I can heave a sigh of relief.
I know this is a session about Kashmir, and I actually hadn't thought, until I read Manreet, I actually read the PDF, because it wasn't out at that point. But until I read that, I didn't realize that I had my own partition stories, being from Kashmir. It's not, you think about Bengal, you think about Punjab. You don't think about Kashmir as fitting into that group of stories. And it was really fascinating to read this because it brought back memories. My parents were 10 and 12 at the time of 47. And they vividly remember the siege of Srinagar and the siege of Shalting, the barbarians at the gate, as we now call them, the Kabali raids. And so this was a very interesting lesson for me, particularly at this time when I just got my translation of Kashmiri stories out, that I've now sort of looked at the past history and the recent history of Kashmir. And it just, as you said, I think, you used a different phrase, but it strikes me that Kashmir definitely is the unfinished business of partition. It's unfinished for a variety of reasons, as we know. The political situation in Kashmir is still simmering. A lot of Kashmiris don't feel that justice was done to them. But it's also now compounded by this exodus of Kashmiri Hindus from Kashmir, which makes it an even more intractable problem. So my question is, was there something different about this last book because of all of this? Because Hyderabad was resolved, as you said. Lahore was never in contention. Were there different ways of approaching this book and this problem with Kashmir that you hadn't thought about, or questions that came up that hadn't occurred to you in the first two books?
Yeah. Thank you, Kalpana. That's a great question. So just for some background, as you said, Lahore was a resolved issue in the sense we know Lahore is in Pakistan, and though the Eastern Punjab can yearn for it, that's where it's going to stay. Hyderabad was a story which has been completely forgotten. We've erased it from our memories. And I realized it early on when I got married, and my husband's a South Indian. And my South Indian family's narrative used to be, we don't have a partition story. No, there is no partition story. And Hyderabad is a partition story. And when the book released, I had people ask me, is it about Hyderabad in Sindh, Pakistan? And I was, no, this is very much our Hyderabad. Now, when I was writing these, as I said, Lahore is set in the months leading up to independence and partition. But thereafter, Hyderabad and Kashmir, the stories are unfolding at the same time. So if I had to put both the stories in the same narrative, I don't think we have the capacity to engage with it, which is why I decided they needed two different books, because also the issues are complex. The narrative changes completely. So I decided to go with Hyderabad first because, in a sense, the story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The circle closes. Willy-nilly, Hyderabad became a part of India. And Kashmir is an ongoing story. I do not have a closure for it. I, as a writer, have got closure, but when you read the book, and I don't want to give it away, it ends in the summer of 1948 when India and Pakistan have battled each other to a stalemate. The two armies are literally on two opposing peaks, and they're watching each other. And from that time to today, I don't think the situation has changed much. I wish there was some solace or some solution I could offer, but I don't think that is the part of a writer. A writer's job is to put the narrative in front of the readers, to introduce the questions, and hopefully to leave you with those questions to fester so you can search the answers for yourself. And as I said earlier, the process of writing these books has involved a 2-decade-long research. And just to, as Kalpana and I were discussing earlier, for the longest time I was tussling. I had the research. I did not know how do I put the narrative together? How do I stitch it? And I remember my nephew saying, "Yeah, Masi, ye kaun padhne wala hai yaar? History is so boring." So, that was my attempt. Because 1947, if I have to replicate the time is a thriller. A lot of writers use the example that it is a horse which is in gallop, and our leaders are trying very hard to just hold on to the reins. So the books are structured in 2 threads. The Delhi thread has Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Dicky Mountbatten as the protagonists. And when I say protagonist, I speak in the voice of Jawahar, Vallabh, and Dicky. So for me, they are flesh and blood characters, and I want readers to see them as that, not as these framed photographs gathering dust, but people who are tussling with real issues about how to get a new India in place and how to get it going, how to deal with the violence and the conflict that has broken out. So that was one motive. And the other was really to look at the Aam Aadmi and Aurat in the places, Lahore, Hyderabad, and Kashmir, who are getting impacted by the decisions being taken in Delhi. So these 2 threads sort of intertwine because I'm trying to show both the things that are happening in both the centers of tension. And really, I don't think there are any easy answers, despite the fact that Lahore ends in a sense of a closed topic, similarly with Hyderabad and Kashmir. But when you read the narratives, they leave you with questions. I don't think there is any easy resolution to partition, which is so contemporary with what is happening around us today.
I think, and we'll get to the Aam Aadmi question in a moment, because that's the other fascinating part of certainly the Kashmir book and the other series. But one of the things that struck me about the Kashmir piece was actually, it was quite poignant. And most people, certainly young people, don't know this, that and you're better with the dates than I am, but sometime in that 47, 48 time frame, Sheikh Abdullah actually went to New York for the first time and didn't like it, didn't think it was as pretty as Kashmir. But he was there at the UN session that was going to decide, at that point they thought, the plebiscite issue of Kashmir. And these are historical details, these are historical facts, but what Manreet brings out beautifully is the poignancy of the moment for these leaders, because at the end of the day, they're human beings. They have, they're leaders and they have major responsibilities, but their responses are human, humane, and sentimental. And I love that part where I think he calls his wife, Begum Jahan, and he says, "Hamari kashti majdhar mein hai." And it's not in any history book, it's not in any textbook, but that was what the man was going through. He was being pulled from both sides. And I think you captured that really beautifully, as you did other parts of what Jawaharlal Nehru, for whom Kashmir was a personal issue, thought about some of these things. But to get to the Aam Aadmi piece, and you've had this thread running through all 3 books, And not only do you talk about, I mean, there's history being made and policies being made at a very high level, but what are the impacts on the people on the ground? And not just ordinary, I mean, what I mean, really ordinary people, not other policy makers. So in the Kashmir piece, you have, and I think in the other two books, you've looked at it with a very feminist lens, because women tend to get very often, as we know, written out of history. Certainly the ordinary common woman. And I think that's the other hallmark of this book, that you take history back to these ordinary women, and you tell us a lot more about what was going on in their lives as the forces are making decisions around them. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So one of my goals with writing the Partition trilogy was really to rescue women from the interstices of history. Because history, certainly in India, and absolutely in large parts of the world, is really his story. It's a story of men doing masculine things on the stage, whereas all research, all data will show you that it is women whose bodies become the battlefield in all of these points of conflict amongst men. So I was very clear that I needed to have women's stories back into the narrative. And I will speak about Kashmir specifically, because this is something people either tend to forget or they're ignorant about, the fact that one is that India and Pakistan went to war literally within 2 months of partition. And in Kashmir, certainly in Srinagar, in the valley, they, because of the violence which was committed by the Kabylis, which was indiscriminate, they committed violence against Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians. It was indiscriminate. And it was feared that if they reach Srinagar, they are again, going to commit the same violence. So they put together a little, encouraged the women to actually form a self-defense militia. And there was a woman, again, you will find very scant references. There are some photographs available of a woman who was with the Salamati Forge, with the women's division. Her name is cited as either Zoon Gujari or Zuni Gujjar, and she was an ace sniper. So as I wrote the story, I need to bring this person out, because she's not just a homemaker or, a person who is suffering, but she's actively putting a resistance. Similarly, there were women who got other women who had suffered from the Kabyle atrocities to band together and establish a cooperative where women artisans got to work. And Sheikh Abdullah was very interested that the artisanal work then could be used to promote the culture and the art of Kashmir. And it was a very, very deliberate and distinct decision on my part to bring these women forward. And while there is war happening, which is men fighting men with soldiers, I have the women, and I'm showing how they are battling in their own way. And those battles and wars are no less fierce or courageous.
Those sections of the book are absolutely fascinating, but I think while we finish up, because we've been told to finish up in a few minutes, I forget which famous writer, but certainly a famous writer said that all reality ends up in fiction at some point in time, and we know that to be true. And we hope that it's because we will not repeat that reality. But we also know that that's not true. It tends to get, especially war and sieges tend to get repeated. And I just want to leave you with one question, is given we have such young demographics in this country, and partition is now over 75 years ago, how do you make young people understand their history and to look at it in a way that they understand that some parts of that history should not be repeated?
Tough question. Mark Twain said history doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. I think it clangs. Look at what is happening in Gaza. That was the partition of Palestine in 1948. The British with their scalpel or their dagger or whatever. And we are still dealing with the ramifications of that. I feel that earlier in the year, I was doing several lit fests and showcasing Lahore and Hyderabad. And I had no idea what to expect from the audience, but I was so hopeful at the end of it all because I had young people come and talk to me. And the gist of the conversation really was, I don't care what the politics is, just tell me what happened. And that's what I'm trying to do with this trilogy of historical fiction, because I feel, as you said, sometimes when truth is bitter, fiction is the way to really tell the stories. And I also want to put it in context that Partition is considered, it is such a cataclysmic event. It involved, when you read in books, they call it the transfer of population. It is such an anodyne term for what is considered the largest migration in modern human history. 12 to 15 million people moved east or west within a span of 3 months. 2 to 5 million people died. We at least have that many stories. Where are they? And that's what I'm trying to do. And I feel the only way we as a people survive is by telling stories, by sharing them, by passing them forward. And science has shown that trauma lives in bodies for at least 3 generations. So this generation is the last generation, really, where the stories can still be circulated. So, we live in hope. Umeed pe duniya kaayam hai.
Thank you.